Today we will learn and reflect on the writings of Seneca. Seneca and the Stoics were the self-help gurus of the ancient world, and Seneca was highly regarded by the early church fathers. Now you may ask, how can we benefit when we ponder the Stoicism of Seneca? Living a godly and moral life is all that mattered to the Stoic philosophers. In this video we will ponder what Seneca tells us about the joys we experience when we truly live the philosophical life. How we can live a happy and content life, whether we are rich, whether we are poor, and how we can avoid groundless fears and other wise advice. At the end of our talk, we'll discuss the sources we use for this video and my blogs that also cover this topic. Please, we welcome interesting questions in the comments. Sometimes these generate short videos of their own. Let us learn and reflect together. Seneca was born into the Roman aristocracy, and unlike Epictetus, another Stoic philosopher who lived a life of poverty and was a former slave of a former slave, Seneca was fabulously wealthy with many estates. Being wealthy and close to the Roman emperors also meant that he lived on the edge. For example, the mad Emperor Caligula once ordered him to commit suicide, which did not happen, and false accusations made his life dicey through the reign of the succeeding Emperor Claudius. Seneca was well educated and was known as a philosopher, so Empress Agrippina, wife of Emperor Claudius, had Seneca recalled from exile and appointed him to tutor her son, the future Emperor Nero. When Nero became emperor, Seneca was one of his advisors, and under the direction of Seneca, Nero, for the first years of his reign, was actually a good and competent emperor. But then Emperor Nero, drunk by absolute power, also slipped into mad cruelty like Caligula. We know the stories of how he insulted and tormented many of the senators, how he murdered his mother Agrippina after several unsuccessful attempts, including sabotaging her boat while she was on an excursion. She simply swam to shore that time, but eventually he had his servants stab her to death. History tells us how the crammed together rickety apartments inside the walls of Rome caught fire, and how much of Rome then burned, and how Emperor Nero, ever the artist, fiddled and sang a song while Rome burned. Or that is at least how the Roman rumor mill ran. Nero did what all good dictators do. He said, "This was not my fault," so he found some helpless minority to blame for the fire, and he lit on the Christians. And Nero persecuted the Christians, feeding many of them to the lions in the Colosseum. Nero even crucified and torched some Christians in his gardens. As Nero was descending into madness, Seneca chose to retire in self-appointed exile at a distant estate, thinking that if he moved far, far away, Nero would not suspect that he was involved in a plot against him, because mad dictators think everyone is involved in a plot against them, because mad dictators also think everyone is talking about them behind their back, because, well, quite often they are. This worked for many years, and Seneca was quite productive in those forced years of leisure, penning many philosophical works. But Seneca was worried. We can tell, because he wrote multiple works about suicide and how the Stoic philosopher should die well, because, well, that was on his mind. Now, if a soldier shows up at your door with a sword and gives you the choice of suicide instead, to me that's extenuating circumstances, so we can't think badly of Seneca for these thoughts. Now, this does not mean that Stoicism condones suicide. This is just not universally true. In particular, Epictetus stridently opposed suicide, although Marcus Aurelius might have been a little bit ambivalent. We'll explore this topic further in a future video. Let us look to see where Seneca fits into these timelines. The first Stoic philosopher Zeno and Diogenes of Sinope and the other Greek Cynic philosophers preceded Seneca by several centuries. Although Seneca mentions he studied Zeno carefully, the writings of these Greek philosophers have mostly been lost, except for some fragments and summaries in the writings of Diogenes of Laertius. Cicero precedes Seneca, but we can see from the timeline that Seneca and St. Paul lived at about the same time. Now, there is a cache of purported correspondence between Seneca and St. Paul's, but scholars are pretty unanimous that these are spurious. We do know that many church fathers admired Seneca, in particular St. Augustine, St. Jerome, and even Tertullian, the church father who famously asked, "What has Athens to do with Jerusalem?" Seneca's life overlaps that of Musonius Rufus, and it is likely that Rufus and his disciple Epictetus studied the works of Seneca. And this is probably true also of Emperor Marcus Aurelius, the last of the classical Stoic philosophers who succeeded Seneca by a few generations. Some of you may ask, why are we including Epicurus in this list, since he is the founder of the Epicurean school of philosophy? Isn't Epicureanism the enemy of Stoicism? Now, we want to warn you about being too detailed in your list of what all Stoic philosophers believe in. Epicurus recommends withdrawing from the active life to spend leisure time with your friends. And what is true in both ancient and modern times is that you need to be somewhat wealthy to afford an Epicurean life of leisure. Epictetus, who lived a life of poverty, despised the Epicureans and rails against them constantly in his writings. However, Seneca, who is both wealthy and who was forced by Nero to live a life of leisure, has many positive references to Epicurus and his philosophy in his letters. Now, I have a blog on Epicurus. In early 2021, we'll also do a video on him. My view is we who earn enough to be in the middle class live an Epicurean lifestyle, since we live for vacations and for the weekends where we can spend time with our family and friends. So you could argue that the philosophy of Epicurus, not so much his successors, but Epicurus, is a type of, well, Stoicism light, although it is definitely inferior to the full Stoicism of Epictetus. Now that we have the broad outline of Seneca's life and times, let's get into what we are really interested in, like, what does Seneca tell us? We will go through his letters somewhat sequentially. How does Seneca start his letters from a Stoic, his moral epistles? Seneca discusses our most precious possession, our possession we can never really possess, our possession that continuously slips through our fingers, the loan we can never repay, the gift we waste through carelessness, the treasure we should not waste, our most precious possession, which is time. Seneca asks, "What man can you show me who places any value on his time, who reckons the worth of each day, who understands that he is dying daily? For we are mistaken when we look forward to death. The major portion of death has already passed. Nothing in life is ours except time. While we postpone, life speeds by, so let us live well, not wasting time." In his next letter on the reading of good books, Seneca compares those who dabble through many books to a traveler who has many acquaintances in many foreign lands, but very few good friends. But Seneca advises us, read deeply of the works and words of a master thinker, to get to know him as you would a good friend. Each day learn something new that improves your life and fortifies your soul. Seneca then shares the thought he learned from Epicurus. Contented poverty is an honorable estate. Seneca adds that this is not poverty at all, for it is not the man who is too little, but the man who craves more, who is poor. What does it matter how much a man has laid up in his safe, or in his warehouse, or how large are his flocks, or how fat is his dividends, if this man covets his neighbor's property, and reckons not his past gains, but his hopes of gains to come, and we might ask, maybe hopes of stealing gains from his neighbor. Do you ask, what is the proper limit to wealth? It is first to have what is necessary, and second to have what is enough. This reminds us of a parable that Jesus told about the rich man and his barns. This rich man said, "I will do this, I will pull down my barns and build bigger ones, and there I will store my grain and all my goods. And I will say to myself, soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years, relax, eat, drink, and be merry." But God said to him, and it's probably the God of Seneca, because this sounds like Seneca's story, "You fool, this very night your life is being demanded of you, and the things you have prepared, whose will they be? So it is with those who store up treasures for themselves, but who are not rich towards God." Seneca comments in his letter on old age, if God is pleased to add to our lives another day, we should welcome it with glad hearts. That man is happiest and is secure in his own possession of himself. When a man says, "I have lived," every morning he wakes up, he receives a bonus. Seneca also reflects on his retirement. Life is most delightful when it is on the downhill slope, but has not yet reached the abrupt decline. While philosophizing in retirement in the quiet of his estates, no doubt Seneca was wondering, when will the mad emperor summon soldiers to visit my estate? So how does Seneca face this fate? He tells us in his letter on groundless fears, where Seneca laments, sometimes the sword is checked at the victim's throat. Sometimes men survive their executioners. Bad fortune is fickle. Maybe it will come, but it has not come yet. So we should look forward to better days. But then Seneca bounces back. Life is not worth living if we multiply our sorrows with our worries. Instead, we should temper our fears with our hopes. Weigh carefully your hopes and your fears, but believe more in your hopes than your fears. And don't let your fears harass your soul. We are too often in the habit of exaggerating or imagining or anticipating sorrows and troubles. Seneca tells us about philosophy. Philosophy is the study of wisdom, for as Seneca writes, no man can live a happy life without the study of wisdom. You must study philosophy every day. You must persevere. You must develop new strength by continuous study until that which is only a good inclination becomes a good habit. Philosophy molds and constructs the soul. It orders our life, guides our conduct, shows us what we should do and what we should leave undone. Philosophy sits at the helm of our ship and directs our course as we waver among the uncertainties of life. Without philosophy, no one can live fearlessly or in peace of mind. Seneca asks us what should be the goal of the philosophers. He tells us that we should, above all, learn how to feel joy. What is joy? Seneca answers, real joy is a stern matter. Real joy endures poverty, endures suffering, endures pain. Real joy is not idle laughter. Real joy does not chase passing pleasures. Pleasure, unless it is controlled, tends to rush headlong into the abyss of sorrow. The frail body, although we can accomplish nothing without it, should be considered only as a necessary thing rather than important. Our frail body involves us in vain pleasures, short-lived and soon to be regretted, which, unless we rein in our body by our extreme self-control, will doom us to a life of misery. What is really good in life? That which comes from a good conscience, from honorable purposes, from right actions, from contempt of the gifts of change, from an even and calm way of living which treads but one path. You must live your life according to guiding purpose, lest you let the trials of life sweep you along like a log floating down a swift river. Seneca and the moral philosophers instruct us to live and examine life so we can improve our morals, so we can learn from our sins and our mistakes, so we can reform our lives. In that way, when he talks about penitence and reforms, he sounds a lot like the early church fathers who followed him in history. Seneca quotes Epicurus, the knowledge of sin is the beginning of salvation, and we might say this is not the shallow type of salvation where we just look forward to, if we're good people, going to heaven. This is the deeper salvation, which is the improvement of our soul so we can become better people. Seneca explains, he who does not know that he has sinned does not desire correction. You must discover yourself in the wrong before you can reform yourself. Some boast of their faults. Do you think that the man has any thought of mending his ways who holds up his vices as if his vices were virtues? Therefore, prove yourself guilty. Hunt up charges against yourself. Play the part first of your accuser, then of judge, last of all the intercessor. At all times be harsh with yourself. This reminds us of the closing part of the prayer of St. Ephrem. Yes, O Lord and King, grant me to see my own faults and not to judge my brother. Many people are okay with change as long as it's the other person who has to do the changing. Don't we all want to find excuses for our faults and failings, but yet be critical of the failings and faults of our neighbors? Rather, we should seek to change our own attitudes and behavior and seek to rationalize the faults and failings of others, seeing that they are but prisoners of their past, bound in chains by years of bad habits and experiences. What distinguishes the virtuous soul? Seneca says that it is the soul that penetrates the whole world and directs its contemplating gaze upon all its phenomena. paying strict attention to thoughts and actions, rising above both hardships and flatteries, yielding neither to poverty nor to fortune, rising above all tribulations and blessings, absolutely beautiful, perfectly equipped with grace and strength, unruffled, never dismayed, unmoved by violence, neither exalted or depressed by chance events. A soul like this is virtue itself. Seneca reminds us, nobody inherits good before evil. Evil inclinations always get first hold of us. Learning virtue means unlearning vice. We must first free ourselves from our faults with courage, for once we attain it, the good can be an everlasting possession. Virtue is not unlearned. But since the weak and diseased mind fears the virtue that is unfamiliar, the first steps to attaining steadfast virtue are toilsome to many. The mind must be forced to make the first step, but from then on the medicine is not so bitter. Living a godly life brings joy and happiness. The draught of philosophy is both wholesome and pleasant. Indeed, Stoicism not only prepared the world for Christianity, Christianity itself echoes Stoic thoughts. Philosophy was to the ancient Greeks what theology and scriptures are to Christians today. Seneca says this about loving philosophy. A philosophy is the only power that can stir us, the only power that can shake us out of our deep slumber, our apathy. Devote yourself wholly to philosophy. You are worthy of her, she is worthy of you. Greet one another with a loving embrace. Say farewell to other interests with courage and frankness. Do not study philosophy merely during your spare time. If he were alive today, Seneca might ask us, do you every day instinctively turn on the TV the minute you walk through the door, letting the noise fill your days and nights? Were we put here on earth so we can be mindlessly entertained by television? Why not instead read and study scriptures and philosophy so that every day we can learn how to be a slightly better person than we were the day before? Seneca advises us to throw aside all hindrances and spend your time to gain a sound mind. Philosophy is a subject for daily practice and study. Philosophy is a mistress, commanding our attention. Turn to philosophy with all your soul, set at her feet, and cherish her. If you do, a great distance will separate you from other venial men. We invite you to ponder our next video on Seneca, which includes his thoughts on virtue, friendship, pleasure, and joy, and other wise topics. And now we will discuss the sources we use for this video. The Stoic six-pack includes the writings of Seneca and Epictetus, although I found their translation of Marcus Aurelius to be unintelligible, so I used another translation for that. These works are also available free on the internet. Professor Luke Timothy Johnson turned me on to reading the Stoic philosophers, and we highly recommend these great Courses lectures. These lectures are not on the Great Courses Plus website, unfortunately. And we'd also like to emphasize that for an affordable annual subscription, you can get all of the classics in both the original Greek or Latin and the English in the Loeb Classical Library. Please click on the link for our blog on Seneca in the description below, and please click on the links for our YouTube videos on the Stoic philosophers and other interesting videos that will broaden your knowledge and improve your soul. Thank you.